This is Chapter 16, Cardiovascular Emergencies. So cardiovascular disease accounts for 1 out of every 3 deaths, and it's definitely something that we can help reduce deaths by encouraging people to follow a healthier lifestyle, granting early access to medical care, improving the quality and the number of people that are trained in CPR, increasing the use of evolving technology in dispatch and cardiac arrest response, more public access to defibrillation devices are being able to recognize the need for ALS intervention early, and then the use of cardiac specialty centers when they're available. Obviously, we don't have a lot of them available out here, so it's not really something we're going to worry about too much. The heart's job is to pump blood to supply oxygen into all of the cells of the body. The heart itself is divided into left and right sides, and each side has an upper chamber, which is the atrium that receives incoming blood, and then the lower chamber, also known as the ventricle, pumps the outgoing blood. So let's go ahead and take a look at the heart here. You've got a right atrium and a left atrium together called the atria. You have a right ventricle, you have a left ventricle together called the ventricles. You have valves that separate the top from the bottom. You have the septum separating the left from the right. And then you have several large blood vessels that come out of the heart and into the heart, and they're there to facilitate the blood flow to either the lungs or to the systemic circulation. The valves that are within the heart are one-way valves, so they prevent the backflow of blood. All of the heart's contractions should be utilized to propel blood forward, not backwards. You can see the flow of blood here. Blood enters that right atrium first via the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, goes down through a one-way valve right there called the tricuspid valve, and goes down into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps through the pulmonary semilunar valve and goes out to the pulmonary arteries, out to the lungs to get oxygenation. Blood then returns to the heart right here through the pulmonary veins. This now is oxygen-rich blood, and it flows into the left atrium, goes down through the valve here, which is the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, goes into the left ventricle, and then is pumped through the aortic semilunar valve up into the aorta, where the majority of the heart's oxygen-rich blood is pumped in order to go throughout systemic circulation, to include the coronary circulation, which feeds the heart itself. The heart is not fed internally by the blood that's running through it. It has its own blood supply. The heart has an electrical system that controls the heart rate and coordinates all the work of both the atria and the ventricles. The heart can generate its own electrical impulse. That's a special feature of cardiac cells. So it starts generally in the sinus node or the SA node, and then is propagated down a preset electrical pathway that goes down to the ventricles, causing coordinated contraction of both of the atria simultaneously, and then both of the ventricles simultaneously. Your heart does not contract right to left, it contracts top to bottom. Here's the overall path of the electrical conduction. It starts with that SA node, which is in the top right of the right atria. That is propagated throughout the entirety of the atria. At the very bottom of the atria is an AV node. Then it's propagated down through the bundle of His into the left and right bundle branches, and then ends at the Purkinje fibers that lines the musculature of both ventricles. No other cells have the ability to create their own electrical impulses. That is something that is specific to the heart itself. Control of the heart, the autonomic nervous system controls all involuntary actions of the body, which includes cardiac function. Remember that there's two parts to that autonomic nervous system that balance each other out. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. That sympathetic, remember, is the fight or flight. So when it gets turned up, because remember, it doesn't ever always shut off, but when it gets turned up, the heart speeds up, your respiratory rate and depth increases, you have a dilation in blood vessels in the muscles, and then a constriction to blood vessels in the digestive system to prepare you to either fight what's causing you to amp up or to run away from that. The parasympathetic is the opposite. When it gets turned up, then it slows the heart rate, respiratory rates, constricts blood vessels in the muscles, dilates blood vessels in the digestive system, because this is the rest and digest, or the feed and breathe system, whichever you'd like to refer to it as. So in times of relaxation, when your body needs to digest food, this system takes over. The myocardium is the heart muscle, myo meaning muscle, cardium referring to the heart. Has to have a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients to pump blood. And as you start working out or walking or increasing your exertion on the heart, you increase the oxygen demand of that heart muscle. And so in order to compensate for that, your heart will dilate the coronary arteries. The coronary arteries are those specific arteries that feed the heart muscle. The stroke volume is an important concept to understand. This is the amount of blood that's ejected with each ventricular contraction. If you can increase stroke volume, you're going to increase cardiac output. Cardiac output is going to help determine the level of perfusion within the body. For supplying the heart itself, you have the coronary arteries, which start at the very first part of the aorta, just above that aortic semilunar valve. The right coronary artery supplies blood to the right atrium and right ventricle, and in most people, the inferior wall of the left ventricle. Some people do have kind of backwards anatomy where the heart vessels are not exactly all the same on the surface, but everything does still get perfused. It just kind of depends. The left coronary artery supplies blood to the left atrium, left ventricle, and then divides into two major branches just a short distance from the aorta. And we'll go on here to the next picture so you can actually see where those are. So you've got several different vessels that supply the heart. You can see the right coronary artery here, and it's called in the coronary sulcus. The sulcus is just a groove on the upside of the heart that those blood vessels are going to run along. You can see all of this yellowish material here. That is fat, indeed, on the outside of the heart. But you've got that right coronary artery that runs along. It feeds the majority of the right portion of the heart, and then the inferior portion of the left ventricle as well. You've got your left coronary artery here. You've got a circumflex branch that travels down to the back of the heart. Your circumflex comes around the front. Your posterior goes around the back of the heart. So your left coronary artery comes down here, feeds the posterior. You've got your circumflex coming to the anterior portion plus the anterior branch of the left coronary artery here. You've also got a coronary vein, which is the blue one, that's going to drain from the heart and go back into that atria. You have other arteries that supply to a lot of different parts of the body. Your left and right carotid arteries supply the head and the brain. The right and left subclavian, right underneath those collarbones, supply the upper extremities. Your brachial artery, which is on the inside of your arm, between your elbow and your shoulder, that supplies the arms themselves. Radial and ulnar arteries supply the lower arms and hands. Your right and left iliac arteries supply the groin, pelvis, and the legs. That further splits into the left and right femoral arteries to supply just the legs themselves. You continue down to the anterior and posterior tibial and peroneal arteries, which supply your lower legs and feet. Your arterioles and capillaries are the smallest of the vessels that receive blood from the arteries. Capillaries, we've talked before, are 1 cell thick, so they definitely facilitate the exchange of oxygen and waste at that cellular level. And then they connect your arterioles, which is the smallest part of your arteries, to your venules, which is the smallest part of your veins. Your venules and veins receive blood from the capillaries, and they return that oxygen poor blood back up to the heart. You have your superior vena cava, which drains the head and the arms and goes back into the right atrium, and your inferior vena cava, which ends up carrying blood from the rest of your body, from your abdomen, your kidneys, and your legs back up to that right atrium. Blood itself consists of several different components. So you've got the liquidy part of your blood, which is called the plasma. You have red blood cells that carry oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. You have white blood cells, which main job is just to fight infection. And then you have platelets, which helps your blood to clot. Blood pressure itself is that force that is pushed against your artery wall as your heart contracts. So systolic blood pressure is the maximum pressure generated in the arms and legs during the contraction of the left ventricle. This is known as systole. We've already talked about that a little bit. This is going to be your top number on your blood pressure. Your diastolic pressure is the pressure exerted against the artery wall when the left ventricle is relaxed. This is the bottom number on that blood pressure reading. The pulse is felt when your heart contracts and forces that blood forward. Peripheral pulses are felt in the extremities. Central pulses are felt near the trunk of the body, so either your femoral or your carotid. Here's a picture right here of all of those different spots, the top two, the carotid and the femoral, being your central pulses. The brachial, radial, posterior tibial, and dorsalis pedis are 4 of your peripheral pulse points. Cardiac output is defined as the volume of blood that passes through the heart in 1 minute. So this is calculated by taking your heart rate, which is measured in a minute increment, timesing that by the volume of blood ejected with each contraction, so the stroke volume, and then you end up getting your cardiac output. In the field, we're not going to come up with this like set number for this, but you can roughly determine it based on the heart rate and the strength of a patient's pulse. You can tell that if they have a weak pulse, that they're probably not perfusing. Good perfusion is required by all of the tissues to get oxygen. You can tell that a person that has good perfusion has a well-functioning heart, has the appropriate heart rate that allows the proper blood flow to be circulated, an adequate volume of fluid, and then the blood vessels constrict or dilate to meet the necessary requirements. If perfusion fails, cellular and eventually patient death occurs.